Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau continued blaming Russia for the standing ovation a Nazi-linked veteran received from the entire parliament last week. Let's watch.
I also want to reiterate how deeply sorry Canada is for the situation this put President Zelensky and the Ukrainian delegation in. It is extremely troubling to think that this egregious error is being politicized by Russia and its supporters to provide false propaganda about what Ukraine is fighting for.
The Canadian Parliament has since apologized for recognizing and applauding the 98-year-old Ukrainian veteran who fought alongside Nazis during World War II, which Trudeau called embarrassing earlier this week. The House of Commons Speaker denying having knowledge of this man's prior affiliation with the Nazi Party. But you still have, Trudeau essentially giving the blame to the speaker. And the speaker probably should have looked into the background. Is this the best veteran we could get coming out of Ukraine? It definitely strengthens this media narrative that's built on the far left in the United States, but also those aligned with Russia, which isn't necessarily the far left in the United States, that we are amplifying Nazis by supporting the Ukrainian coalition in their fight against the Russian invasion. There are members of the Azov battalion that have been bolstered by Zelensky. And that's something that even people within Ukraine are critical of. But the sentiment among Ukrainians is overwhelmingly that we will take whatever fighting force we can to get the Russians out of Ukraine. That is their number one priority. And they'll handle the factions within Ukraine as they have been for quite some time during the civil war there. And so they're not as welcoming of this coalition of the West as we would think they are. They more so now, because of this war, have a nationalized view of Ukraine. A lot of Ukrainians that formerly would have really liked to join the European Union now have more of a sense of Ukrainian identity and don't really trust the West as much as they did before. They don't really want to join NATO like they did before because they see a lot of the Western countries as having failed supporting them to the extent that they would have needed to defeat Russia early on before the casualties of the war reached where they are now. So it's an extremely nuanced situation, but this definitely adds fuel to that fire.
Yeah, I find it so typical for our leaders, not our leaders, but political leaders generally, to pass off accountability, pass the buck, refuse to take responsibility for giving a standing ovation to a literal Nazi. In this case, Bria and I talked a little bit about this on the show yesterday, but we didn't get to see the video where this guy literally says that he fought against Russia in World War II. Anybody who has a decent grasp on history knows exactly what that means, and yet everybody in that chamber, like a bunch of clapping seals, stood up and cheered for this guy anyway. And it should have never gotten to that point in the first place. And so I think there's a legitimate discussion to be had about why there are so many Nazis in Ukraine and why US dollars and Canadian dollars have apparently gone to helping bolster those Nazis, the failure of accounting, the failure of tracing this money to make sure that it's not falling into those hands is pretty abysmal, especially considering just the volume of money we've been spending, tens of billions of dollars at this point on pretty much a regular basis. So I don't blame the Republicans in Congress for saying, hey, time to hit the stop switch on all of this money and this weaponry that we're sending over to Ukraine. There's also this report from the Ottawa Citizen that said a Jewish advocacy group is calling on the Canadian government to release a secret 40-year-old report and other documents containing details about alleged Nazi war criminals living in Canada. According to the report, the federal government has withheld a second part of a 1986 government commission about Nazis who settled in Canada, and it has heavily censored another 1986 report examining how the Nazis were able to get into the country. More than 600 pages of the document have been censored. So this is clearly a deeper issue that needs to be addressed. I think it's problematic that Justin Trudeau kind of brushed it off as a blip on the radar when it's obviously something a bit deeper than that. And to just spin it into Russia propaganda, or it's Russia's fault that this Nazi somehow ended up on the floor of Parliament, does nothing towards actually ensuring that something like this doesn't happen again.
Yeah, it's interesting. Canada has a history of being quite good at deciding who is deserving of political asylum when it comes to the case of the Rwandan genocide. You had a lot of folks try and come to the United States through Canada, some of them successfully, but you also had these trials to assess if someone qualified for political asylum, and war criminals do not. And time and again, they've found that folks are not able to qualify for asylum because they fall in the category of war criminal in the case of the Rwandan genocide. And we've had those same people come through the woods of Maine into the United States and then be tried in Boston, only to find that, yes, they are war criminals and they don't qualify for political asylum. And so then we reach this situation where what do we do with these folks? Where do we send them? They won't stay in Rwanda or whatever country they committed war crimes in because it's clearly unsafe for them. But where do they go? What do we do with these individuals? It's an interesting geopolitical question. But in the case of Canada, why would they be more sympathetic of Nazis than folks on either side of the Rwandan genocide? I think that poses a really intense political question for members of parliament in Canada who stood that day, that they didn't pick up on that statement that they fought on the side of Russians in World War II. That should very clearly indicate that they were a part of the Nazi coalition. And so I think it's an interesting moment for Canadians to interrogate what is going on in their parliament, why their political and judicial process is more sympathetic to Nazis than they are folks who were present in Rwanda during the genocide.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, his statement that he fought against Russia would be like the equivalent of saying he fought against the United States in World War II, which should have given everyone pause. We now have learned as well that Poland's education minister is apparently taking steps to try to extradite this individual and have him put on trial for war crimes and for slaughtering the Polish people. The Canadian immigration minister as well has talked about this Jewish group's complaint about the harboring of secrets regarding Canada's allowance of Nazis to enter its country. And he said something pretty chilling, which was that in many cases, Nazis were able to get into Canada more easily than Jewish people. And it's just kind of infuriating, particularly coming from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who kind of has this air of moral superiority about him. He said really nasty things about the truckers who were protesting against vaccine mandates in their industry, and even seized money that was donated to them through some of these banking systems. And then to find out that he is involved in this honoring of a Nazi and that his own government has been covering up the allowance of Nazis entering their country and having safe harbor there is just so ironic.
Yeah, I think Trudeau's lack of active acknowledgement and lack of support given for territories affected by wildfires that are overwhelmingly occupied by Indigenous peoples all across Canada signals to me that he's not very much in touch with communities that are traditionally oppressed in Canada or globally. I think there needs to be much more concentration on the fact that the Canadian government has largely ignored a lot of the wildfires if they overwhelmingly affect Indigenous communities, and has paid attention when they potentially will affect typically, settler communities where they have large cities in Canada that are not occupied by overwhelmingly Indigenous peoples. And so Trudeau has a track record of also dressing up. I think he's been caught doing blackface, certainly has been caught dressing up as an Indigenous person for Halloween. He's not someone who's free of political scandal. So for him to speak on this with any sort of moral superiority is a bit ridiculous. And I think he's thankful that he can pass off blame to the speaker in this case, but he definitely did need to apologize. It's good he did say, "I'm sorry," in that speech. I think the case of Nazis in Ukraine is interesting because I think of it from the perspective of what happens in a post-war Ukraine. I mean, post-war with Russia. Obviously, the Ukrainian civil war was raging before Russia decided to invade. What's going to happen now that you have a generally armed populace post-war with Russia? I'm not sure how things are going to shake out in Ukraine, but it could be the kind of scenario where we're in a forever war and the United States tries to play the role of peacekeeping to keep the violence from spilling into other NATO countries. And so I think post-war Ukraine, if you have a group of people who are Nazis or follow that ideology, whether they participated in World War II or not, or are guided by those who did, I think it's a very interesting political question that we need to start thinking about now, because this could be the scenario where we continue to send troops there to keep peace within Ukraine, even after Russia leaves.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out as well that PM Trudeau also took more responsibility for a literally fake story about Indigenous people being buried in shallow graves near a residential Catholic school that led to the vandalizing of hundreds of Catholic churches throughout Canada. Ended up not being true than he did for his parliament standing and applauding a Nazi. So it kind of tells you everything you need to know about that guy. That's going to do it for us this week on Rising. Jess, it was wonderful to be back at the desk with you today.
Yeah, it was good to do another show together. For our listeners, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available wherever you listen to podcasts. Bye, y'all.
See you next week.